History has a way of whispering before it shouts. Sometimes the whisper sounds like confidence, like the voice of a crowd insisting that everything will be fine, that progress always moves forward, that collapse is something that happens to other societies and other eras. And then, as if on cue, the floor gives way. Not because history is cruel, but because patterns repeat when we don't listen. Today, we're told that the modern financial system is resilient, strong, adaptable. We're told that markets recover, economies bounce back, nations stabilize, progress corrects itself. And sometimes that's true, until it isn't. The belief in the bounce back is one of the most comforting illusions in the modern world, a sort of cultural lullaby that keeps us from panicking when the cracks appear beneath our feet. Economists reassure us with charts. Politicians reassure us with speeches. The media reassures us with headlines, predictions, confident commentary. But beneath all of it lies a more ancient story. A story older than our stock markets, older than capitalism, older than paper money itself. Civilizations rise, they flourish, they innovate. They believe they are different from those that came before. Then they overshoot, then they decay. And when collapse arrives, it doesn't always look like fire and ruin. Often it looks like denial. It looks like the insistence that we will recover, just give it time. The problem is not that bounce backs never happen. They do. History is full of them. But every bounce back has its limit. And when a society crosses a certain threshold, when inequality stretches too far, when public trust fractures too deeply, when the financial system becomes too leveraged, too abstract, too detached from real value, the bounce back stops being a cycle and starts being a cliff. The dangerous myth is believing that the cliff does not exist. We are living in a moment where the myth is stronger than the memory. Many people genuinely believe that decline cannot truly happen anymore. That technology, global trade, and modern finance have somehow exempted us from history. But history has no exemptions, only patterns. And perhaps the most universal pattern of all is this. Collapse never feels like collapse at first. It feels like an inconvenience. It feels like a debate. It feels like temporary discomfort, something you can wait out. A recession that will correct. A currency crisis that will stabilize. A government scandal that will settle with time. A debt bubble that just needs a few adjustments. Until each of those temporary disruptions calcifies into something permanent. Until the systems that once held a society together are no longer trusted, no longer believed in, no longer functioning at the scale they once did. By the time a collapse is obvious, it is already too late. The myth of the bounce back survives because it is emotionally comforting. It allows us to believe that no matter how deep the disruption, no matter how loud the alarm bells, we can simply continue. That the past was chaotic, but we are modern. We are advanced. We have central banks. We have global markets. We have data, models, economists, experts. The Romans had philosophers and state treasuries too. The Venetians had banks older than most modern nations. The Spanish Empire controlled global trade routes. The British Empire ruled a quarter of the world. Their experts believed in the bounce back too, and yet each of them followed the same curve. Innovation, expansion, complacency, imbalance, correction, denial, collapse. The idea that we are different is not evidence, it is ego. And ego is the most expensive belief a society can hold. In this series, we are not here to predict doom. We are here to recognize patterns, to see the rhythm that history teaches us, again and again. The pattern is not about disaster. It is about reality. Civilizations rise, they decline. And sometimes, if they recognize the truth before it's too late, they adapt. The question before us is, which stage are we in now? And are we willing to admit the answer? Every civilization believes it is the exception. This is not arrogance in the loud, dramatic sense. It's quieter than that. It lives in the background of daily life, in the assumptions people make without realizing they're making them. The assumption that tomorrow will look like today. That stability is the default condition of society. That progress is automatic, constant, guaranteed. The pattern begins with growth. A society discovers something, new land, new resources, new trade routes, new technology. Wealth expands, infrastructure develops. Cities rise, art and culture flourish. People feel proud to be part of something ascending. This is the era of optimism and identity. Then, growth becomes prosperity. Prosperity becomes comfort. Comfort becomes expectation. And expectation becomes entitlement, not always individually, but collectively. The population begins to assume that the institutions supporting daily life are permanent, that the currency will always hold value, that food will always be available, that the government, even if flawed, will function well enough. In this phase, the future feels secure. But beneath prosperity, imbalance grows. Sometimes it looks like widening inequality, where the gains of the system concentrate at the top. Sometimes it looks like debt expanding faster than real productivity. Sometimes it looks like the culture shifting from producers to consumers, where the memory of effort fades and the focus becomes lifestyle and leisure. Yet, even as imbalance grows, the belief in resilience strengthens. People say, "We have been through worse before and recovered." They point to past recessions, past wars, past crises, and declare those as proof that bounce back is inevitable. But they forget a crucial truth. Each recovery carries a cost. Each intervention, each bailout, each emergency policy transfers strain forward in time. Little by little, the foundation that once supported the society becomes thinner. The cracks spread, but they spread quietly. And this is where denial enters the pattern. A society rarely recognizes decline when it begins. The first signs feel manageable. Prices rise, but that's just inflation. Trust erodes, but that's just politics. Public discourse fractures, but it's just a cultural moment. Productivity falls, but technology will solve it. National debt skyrockets, but we'll grow out of it. People aren't irrational. They simply cling to the narrative that has always worked before. The narrative that recovery is natural. The narrative that correction is temporary. The narrative that collapse happens slowly, with warning, and with time to respond. But collapse is not a moment. Collapse is a curve. It accelerates quietly and then suddenly. Yet right up until the moment when the curve turns downward sharply, the majority still believe there will be a rebound. And when collapse does begin to feel real, when the currency falters, when institutions lose credibility, when societal trust fractures, the instinct is not adaptation. The instinct is doubling down on what used to work. In ancient Rome, when inflation spiraled out of control, leaders did not restructure the monetary system. They printed more coins with less silver. In the final generation of the Qing dynasty in China, when bureaucracy could no longer manage the empire, they didn't overhaul governance. They expanded it, adding layers to compensate for weakness. In the late stage of the Ottoman Empire, when the economy stagnated, leaders did not reinvent industry. They borrowed enormous sums from foreign creditors to maintain appearances. In every case, the belief was the same. We just need a little more time. Things will stabilize. They always have. The bounce-back myth is not just a story, it is a psychological cycle. People prefer familiar failure to unfamiliar change. Leaders prefer maintaining power to restructuring it. Elites prefer preserving advantage to distributing risk. And societies, at scale, will choose the comfort of denial over the discomfort of realism until the cost of denial becomes unbearable. The tragedy is not that civilizations collapse. The tragedy is that they almost always could have adapted, but didn't because they believed they were immune to the very pattern they were living through. The myth of exceptionalism blinds every era until the era ends. Imagine a baker in late Republican Rome around the year 90 BCE. His name does not survive because history rarely records the names of ordinary people, but we can imagine him clearly. He wakes before dawn, kneads dough by lamplight, and listens to customers speak of politics while the bread rises. Rome is powerful, wealthy, feared. But something feels off. Grain prices change more often than weather. The coins he receives feel lighter in his hand as if made of tin instead of silver. The wealthy senators in distant forms debate endlessly, and every year the gap between their fortunes and his grows wider. Yet when the baker expresses worry, customers laugh and say, "Rome is eternal. There have been shortages before." They speak of the bounce back as if it is guaranteed, permanent. Even as corruption spreads, even as taxes increase, even as veterans return from foreign wars unable to find land or work, the belief remains, Rome always stabilizes, until the baker can no longer afford the grain he needs to make bread. His shop closes. He tells himself it's temporary, but the economy never truly recovers. The middle class dissolves, and the republic which once felt unshakable decays into dictatorship. The baker did not witness Rome's final fall, but he lived through the moment when people still believed collapse was impossible. That is how collapse feels from the inside. Not like a fall, but like a slow thinning of what used to be solid. Now, shift to a woman in late-stage Venice, 1600s. Venice was once a marvel, the trade empire of the Mediterranean, its ships carrying silk, spices, glass, gold. But this woman works in a glass workshop on Murano, where the furnaces glow like miniature suns. For generations, glassmakers in Venice were respected, protected, even envied. Their craftsmanship built fortunes. But now, Dutch and English trade fleets dominate the seas. The Ottoman Empire redirects commerce. Venice's channels still shine beneath the moon, but wealth no longer flows through them the way it once did. Still, the woman believes what everyone around her believes. Venice always adapts. Venice always rebounds. Venice has survived wars, plagues, storms. Venice is clever. Venice is eternal. So when taxes rise again, when wages fall again, when the government restricts movements of workers to keep skills from leaking to foreign competitors, she accepts it. Everyone says the decline is temporary, but slowly the city's workshops close, its shipyards grow quiet, trade slips through its fingers. Her grandson, years later, does not learn glassmaking. He becomes a laborer for foreign merchants. Venice did not fall in fire. It fell in slow, polite silence. The people inside believed in recovery until long after recovery was no longer possible. Now, traveled to Argentina in 2001. This story is recent enough that some who lived it are still alive today. A schoolteacher, earning enough to support her family, deposits her savings every month in a local bank. She has lived through inflation before, currency controls before, political instability before. Argentina always bounces back. That's what everyone says. Generations have heard that slogan. Esto es temporal. This is temporary. So when inflation ticks up, she is concerned but not alarmed. When the government assures citizens that the peso and the US dollar are safely tied, she believes it. Why wouldn't she? Belief in stability is easier than imagining the alternative. Then, in December, the banks freeze withdrawals. Corralito. Overnight, her savings, everything she worked for, becomes inaccessible. Crowds gather. Protests erupt. The government collapses. The currency collapses. Her life does not end. Her family survives. But the promise of stability, the promise of recovery, the promise of the bounce back, and breaks permanently. Those who lived through it say that the collapse did not feel like a sudden event. It felt like a narrowing hallway. Every month, just a little tighter, a little harder, a little more strained, until the door slammed shut. In each of these stories, ancient Rome, Renaissance Venice, modern Argentina, the pattern is the same. Ordinary people believed recovery was natural because recovery had always happened before. Confidence was not stupidity, it was memory. But every memory has a limit, and when decline crosses that limit, the belief in the bounce back becomes a trap, one that keeps societies moving forward in the exact direction that leads to collapse. Look around today, and the signs feel familiar, though they rarely announce themselves loudly. They move through the background, subtle, almost polite, like the slow dimming of a light bulb rather than a sudden blackout. The belief in the bounce back is everywhere. When markets crash, analysts on television say, "We've seen corrections before, this is normal." When national debt rises into the trillions, politicians say, "Debt is manageable, growth will offset it." When wages stagnate while the cost of living climbs steadily higher, people comfort themselves by remembering that their parents also lived through tough times and things eventually worked out. But the question is not whether challenges occur. The question is whether the foundation that supports recovery is still strong, and this is where the modern world begins to rhyme with the past. In many countries, wealth has concentrated into the hands of a smaller and smaller group, just as it did in late Republican Rome. A middle class that once felt secure now feels like it is slipping inch by inch into precarity. Home ownership, once a marker of stability, now feels distant or impossible for many. Education, once a ladder upward, has become expensive enough to trap people in debt. Healthcare, energy, food, all of it feels heavier, harder, more uncertain. And yet, the narrative of resilience is repeated with near religious confidence. We will bounce back. We always do. Meanwhile, the financial system grows increasingly abstract. Money moves faster than value. Debt outpaces production. Wealth is generated not by making things, but by trading things that represent things. This is the same pattern that unfolded in Venice when commerce became speculation, when trade routes shifted, but identity remained rooted in an older memory of greatness. People still believed Venice was rich long after the wealth had begun to drain away. Today, many nations still believe they are economically strong because the numbers in financial markets look impressive, while the lived experience of ordinary people tells a very different story. And beneath all of this, trust, the invisible currency that holds societies together, frays. Governments no longer feel legitimate. Political discourse splinters into tribes, each convinced the other is the enemy. Institutions that once felt solid now feel uncertain, improvised, exhausted. The media no longer informs, it agitates. Communities no longer feel connected. They feel anxious, defensive, isolated. This is not collapse, but it is the preconditioned collapse requires a society where the center no longer holds. And yet, the bounce-back myth persists, because admitting the alternative requires discomfort. It requires acknowledging that the systems we depend on may not be self-correcting anymore. People say, technology will save us. And yes, technology has changed everything, but it has also accelerated problems faster than we can solve them. Artificial intelligence promises efficiency, yet may dismantle entire industries before new ones stabilize. Global supply chains deliver abundance, yet a single disruption can leave shelves empty in days. Digital markets move trillions in milliseconds, yet a single algorithmic cascade can wipe out wealth faster than human beings can react. The speed of modern systems means the shocks are no longer slow, predictable, or absorbable. The world has become interconnected, but also interdependent. That means resilience is no longer guaranteed. It must be consciously maintained. And right now, maintenance is not what most societies are practicing. Instead, we are practicing distraction, entertainment over reflection, outrage over analysis, confidence over caution. Not because people are foolish, but because it is frightening to acknowledge that these patterns are not historical accidents. They are structural. They emerge whenever wealth outpaces value, whenever debt outpaces trust, whenever identity clings to what used to be true instead of what is true now. The modern world is not doomed, but it is at a decision point. The question is not whether the bounce back is possible. The question is whether we are mistaking the memory of recovery for the capacity for recovery. Because history shows the same rule. Bounce backs work until the underlying structure breaks. And once it breaks, the society that assumed recovery was automatic finds itself shocked, not by collapse, but by how long it had been collapsing already. So what does it feel like to live in a pre-collapse moment? Not dramatic, not cinematic, not apocalyptic. It feels like life today, normal but thinner, familiar but more fragile. It feels like knowing something is off, even if you can't name it directly. It feels like being tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, like waiting for something to change, but not knowing what. In pre-collapse eras, life does not stop. People still go to work, they still fall in love, they still raise children, they still make dinner and wash dishes and pay bills and worry about the same everyday things they always worried about. But beneath that routine is a quiet pressure, a subtle tightening, as if the air in the room has become heavier. People feel it in conversations that trail off into sighs. They feel it in the price of groceries creeping upward a little more each week. They feel it in the way friends and family argue about politics more intensely than before, as if their identity depends on it. They feel it in the loneliness that seems to spread even in crowded cities, the sense that everyone is close but nobody is connected. It is the sensation of standing on shifting ground while trying to convince yourself the earth is solid. In times like these, people don't panic. They rationalize. They say, things go in cycles, to comfort themselves. They say, this is just temporary, to shield themselves. They say, someone will fix this, because the alternative is too heavy to carry alone. Collapse does not feel like chaos until the very end. It feels like waiting. It feels like hoping that someone, somewhere, will take responsibility. But collapse begins when everyone assumes someone else will act. This is the quiet tragedy of societies in decline. The recognition comes slowly, individually, privately, and the realization that others have felt it too comes late, often too late to change course. And yet, there is something profoundly human about this moment, because awareness is not doom, it is awakening. When the myth of automatic bounce back breaks, people begin to ask deeper questions. What does real stability look like? What truly matters in life? What foundations are actually worth rebuilding? People start to rediscover things lost in the pace of the modern world. The importance of relationships, of community, of meaning that can't be bought or proven or displayed. When systems grow unstable, human beings begin searching for what is real again. And this is where the emotional crossroads lies. Some people turn inward and shut down, thinking, there's nothing I can do. Others turn outward and lash out, looking for someone to blame. But some, the ones who shape what comes next, turn toward understanding. They look at history not with fear, but with clarity. They recognize the pattern not as destiny, but as instruction. They see collapse not as an enemy, but as a message, that something in the structure needs to change, that something in the way we have lived must be reevaluated, that the next era cannot be built on the assumptions of the old one. And that adaptation is still possible, but only if we stop telling ourselves the bounce back is guaranteed. The most powerful shift a person can make in a moment like this is to move from expecting recovery to preparing for transformation. Because when collapse is understood not as destruction, but as transition, the fear begins to loosen its grip. Collapse becomes a teacher, a mirror, a warning, and also a doorway. Every era that has ever fallen has given rise to another. The question is not whether change is coming. The question is whether we meet it consciously, or wait until it forces itself upon us. The emotional courage of this moment is not about predicting disaster or withdrawing from the world or abandoning hope. It is about being willing to see clearly, to feel the discomfort, to acknowledge the pattern, and to ask quietly and honestly, if the bounce back is not guaranteed, then what do we build instead? Myth of the bounce back stops being a comfort and starts being a question. If history does not guarantee recovery, then what happens next? This is where the story shifts from observation to responsibility. Because once a person sees the pattern, they cannot unsee it. They begin to notice the conversations, where people speak with confidence, but not conviction. They notice the strain in institutions that were once unquestioned. They notice how often solutions today resemble temporary patches instead of structural change. They notice how many people are waiting, not actively participating in the shaping of the future, but waiting for the past to return. And deep down, they know the past is not coming back. But this is not a story of despair. It is a story of choice. Every collapse in history has created two groups of people. The first group holds tightly to the old system, trying to save it at any cost, because their identity is tied to how things were. The second group understands that the world ahead will not look like the world behind and begins shaping themselves for what comes next. The first group fears uncertainty. The second group uses it. The first clings to nostalgia. The second studies reality. The first asks, how do we get back to normal? The second asks, what is the new normal we want to create? This is where you, the listener, the thinker, the witness, step into the narrative. You do not control national economies. You do not rewrite financial policy. You do not steer global trade networks. But you do control how you think, how you prepare, how you adapt. The greatest power you have in times like these is to shift from passive participant to active observer, to understand the system you live inside, to see the mechanisms instead of the surface. When you understand the system, you no longer fear it. You begin to see the leverage points, the areas where small changes create large differences. History shows that the people who flourish after collapse are not the strongest, or the richest, or the luckiest. They are the ones who recognize the turning point early enough to adapt their behavior, their expectations, and their identity. And adaptation starts with seeing clearly. So here's the question we carry forward into the next chapter of this series. If the bounce back is not automatic, if recovery is not guaranteed, if history shows that every system eventually reaches a point where it must transform, then how does one prepare psychologically and practically for a transformation on the scale of a civilization? The answer is not panic. The answer is not withdrawal. The answer is not rejection of society. The answer begins with understanding value, real value, not symbolic value, the value of skills that remain useful regardless of economic structure, the value of relationships that build resilience rather than dependence, the value of community, cooperation, and trust, the real currency that holds societies together when financial currency falters, the value of being able to navigate change rather than resist it, and most importantly, the value of knowing which parts of the old system should be let go and which parts are worth carrying into the next era. In the next episode, we will examine exactly that. Not collapse as an ending, but collapse as a transition, a clearing of space for something new to emerge. We will talk about how people in past eras navigated the shift between stability and transformation, how they found security when institutions failed, how they built new forms of community when the old ones fractured, how they preserved dignity and identity when the world they knew dissolved around them. Most importantly, we will explore what we can learn from them, in our time, in our lives, in our daily decisions. Because the story is not finished. We are living inside it, and the next move is ours. So the question we leave open is not, will we collapse? The question is, how do we prepare to rise differently than before? That is where we go next. So we arrive here, at the threshold between recognition and response, the place where the myth of the bounce back stops being a comfort and starts being a question. If history does not guarantee recovery, then what happens next? This is where the story shifts from observation to responsibility, because once a person sees the pattern, they cannot unsee it. They begin to notice the conversations where people speak with confidence, but not conviction. They notice the strain in institutions that were once unquestioned. They notice how often solutions today resemble temporary patches instead of structural change. They notice how many people are waiting, not actively participating in the shaping of the future, but waiting for the past to return. And deep down they know the past is not coming back. But this is not a story of despair. It is a story of choice. Every collapse in history has created two groups of people. The first group holds tightly to the old system, trying to save it at any cost, because their identity is tied to how things were. The second group understands that the world ahead will not look like the world behind, and begins shaping themselves for what comes next. The first group fears uncertainty. The second group uses it. The first clings to nostalgia. The second studies reality. The first asks, how do we get back to normal? The second asks, what is the new normal we want to create? This is where you, the listener, the thinker, the witness, step into the narrative. You do not control national economies. You do not rewrite financial policy. You do not steer global trade networks. But you do control how you think, how you prepare, how you adapt. The greatest power you have in times like these is to shift from passive participant to active observer, to understand the system you live inside, to see the mechanisms instead of the surface. When you understand the system, you no longer fear it. You begin to see the leverage points, the areas where small changes create large differences. History shows that the people who flourish after collapse are not the strongest or the richest or the luckiest. They are the ones who recognize the turning point early enough to adapt their behavior, their expectations, and their identity. And adaptation starts with seeing clearly. So here is the question we carry forward into the next chapter of this series. If the bounce back is not automatic, if recovery is not guaranteed, if history shows that every system eventually reaches a point where it must transform, then how does one prepare psychologically and practically for a transformation on the scale of a civilization? The answer is not panic. The answer is not withdrawal. The answer is not rejection of society. The answer begins with understanding value, real value, not symbolic value, the value of skills that remain useful regardless of economic structure, the value of relationships that build resilience rather than dependence, the value of community, cooperation, and trust, the real currency that holds societies together when financial currency falters, the value of being able to navigate change rather than resist it, and most importantly, the value of knowing which parts of the old system should be let go and which parts are worth carrying into the next era. In the next episode, we will examine exactly that. Not collapse as an ending, but collapse as a transition, a clearing of space for something new to emerge. We will talk about how people in past eras navigated the shift between stability and transformation, how they found security when institutions failed, how they built new forms of community when the old ones fractured, how they preserved dignity and identity when the world they knew dissolved around them. Most importantly, we will explore what we can learn from them in our time, in our lives, in our daily decisions, because the story is not finished. We are living inside it, and the next move is ours. So the question we leave open is not, will we collapse? The question is, how do we prepare to rise differently than before? That is where we go next.